mean, I think that this movement is very interesting because it's been led and in a lot of ways organized and strategized by Black women, by Black feminists, by Black queer identifying feminists. Also cisgender Black men, trans women, LGBTQ, straight men, the whole works. We've always had those groups of people involved in the movement, but they haven't always been at the center of the movement. So we think about the Combahee River Collective. We think about Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin. We think about Barbara Smith and Audre Lorde. Those of us who do and know the work of Black feminists, both intellectuals, when we're thinking about people like Ida B. Wells, who's an intellectual activist who just won the Pulitzer Prize, but also people within part of antebellum slavery. If we think about Mariah Stewart, if we think about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, people like Anna Julia Cooper, what we see with Black feminist traditions is that they've always been articulating what Kimberly Crenshaw later calls intersectionality, but basically the multiplicity of Black identity. And they've also largely been very critical of patriarchy and critical of what we now call racial capitalism, which is really a big term for racist capitalism, this idea that historically capitalism is based on the super exploitation of Black bodies, Black people. And in a lot of ways, when we think about that exploitation, that's both during slavery, during Jim Crow, during the period of mass incarceration, all the way up until the present that we're speaking. So in a lot of ways, when we think about these movements, there's sort of a river to these movements. These movements flow and ebb. Vincent Harding has the great There Is a River book, but Paula Giddings has done great stuff on When and Where I Enter about Black women. Obviously, Bell Hooks. There's so much here that's very, very rich. And in many ways, all these movements have always been decentralized, including the Black Lives Matter movement. But when we think about civil rights and Black power and other movements, they were decentralized, but they were representative figures. Sometimes we think of them as leaders. So we think about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., you think about people like Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver. You think about A. Philip Randolph. You think about Amy Jacques Garvey, Nannie Helen Burroughs. These folks might be leaders of specific organizations, the Black Club Women, right? Frances Harper, Mary McLeod Bethune. So many different Black women and men. So in a lot of ways, what Ella Baker talked about in the 1960s, strong people don't need a strong leader, has really been emblematic of these contemporary times where, and even the three Black women who created the hashtag didn't necessarily create the movement. They gave, a hashtag, and popularizing that is very, very important. And I respect them. I teach Patrisse Khan-Colors' When They Call You a Terrorist with Asha Bandele. But it's bigger than them. It's bigger than them. So when we think about social movements are really predicated upon historical context and then sort of grassroots organizing in defense of Black people. And so in a lot of ways, the first social movement is going to be not just abolition, but slave revolts, the revolts and the rebellions of enslaved Africans, both in America and the Caribbean, everywhere. Sometimes people call it maroonage. When we think about maroon societies and this idea of building autonomous Black-led communities. So in that sense, what we're seeing today in the present has a long history that it unfolds into.
Excellent. I really appreciate you contextualizing that. And as our third guest in the series, I want to formally introduce you. I mean, you are a dynamo in your own right among the giants that you've named, just in terms of, in many ways, but I think especially in the way in which you make a history that can seem distant so accessible to both academics and community folk, which I think is integral to any movement and the momentum that drives a movement around liberation and emancipation. So I thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to officially and formally welcome you, Dr. Peniel Joseph. Thank you so very much for being here again as a guest on our Calaboose African American History Museum virtual talk series. You are going to continue all of this genius that you're giving us with a discussion entitled A Familiar Moment, Re-examining Historical Movements and Leaders of the Past. And you've done that in a beautiful way. As a matter of fact, just today, there was a piece in the New Yorker. It was an interview, I believe, with Barbara Smith. And it spoke about, I think the leading quote, if I'm wrong and I don't have it in front of me, was something to the effect of, no one can be free until Black women are free. And obviously that's tied to the Combahee River Collective. And I've always said Combahee all this time, and I got to see her at the Schomburg. It was thrilling. I was fangirling all the way. Last year, I got to hear and sit in her presence. And she said that she just learned that it was the Combahee River Collective. And so she made us say aloud with her that it's the Combahee River. So I'll say Combahee and probably Combahee, which I've been saying for all of these years throughout. But I really appreciate you excavating all of these figures who were not only figures, but I think one of the things that, and we spoke to this previously, but I want to bring it back to the central focus of the conversation. I think one of the things that happens with leadership and our hunger and desire in this very contemporary space and moment for leadership is that we kind of make those who were in the trenches and doing the work in real time in their era icons in the now. And I think that sometimes diminishes the complexities of who they were, as well as it can also, I think, trivialize to a degree their contributions. For example, everyone's seen Angela Davis, with the raised fist as an icon, as almost memorabilia, if you will, or paraphernalia on shirts, on buttons, but may not necessarily know that she herself does not identify with having been a member of the Black Panther Party, right? And I think what happens when we create this iconic rememory, if you will, or remembering, if you will, of certain figures, I think we kind of align them and sometimes misalign them in ways that are an oversimplification of who they were. So you just wrote a book that is amazing, The Sword and the Shield, amazing. And I'll share with you a personal anecdote about why everybody on my Christmas list is getting your book. And I'm being sincere, because I'm a product of the 80s and 90s in terms of my formative development. And in Black conscious and Black identity conscious households and circles, there was always a kind of unusual side. On the music side, you had Prince and Michael Jackson. But in terms of the Black identity conscious side, you had MLK and Malcolm X, right? Like, who did you identify with? Turning the cheek or By Any Means Necessary? Yeah. So I really, again, and I say that to say that there is something, I think, tragic when we create a clear division around the complexity of these individuals and resign them only to what we associate as their icons. So I would like to, or their iconography. So I'd like to ask you in that very long-winded introduction to please continue, if you will, why you decided to write the book. What was the impetus? What catalyzed that? Because one of the things I'm appreciating in reading it is that it erases that clear line that so many of us grew up thinking existed.
Yeah, I grew up in New York City as well, and the child of the 80s and 90s. My mother was my first historian and first feminist, and just incredible. And I think that I was always interested in Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. I grew up in more of a Malcolm X household and Malcolm X neighborhood, and somebody who identified more with Malcolm X than Martin Luther King Jr. And really over now decades of doing this research and doing the archival work on Black Power, on Stokely Carmichael, on others, Malcolm and Martin, their speeches, I came to see that, I had gotten it wrong. I thought that people had gotten it wrong. I thought that some scholars got aspects of it right, but I didn't think that anybody got it completely right. So there's great books on them separately. James Cone, who I'm a great admirer of, has the Malcolm and Martin book. But I thought people stressed differences and divergences, and I understood why. I think that part of what happened to them was that they were engulfed by media depictions of them. They had suspicion amongst their own camps. But the deeper I got, I saw that they really served as each other's alter egos in a lot of ways. They both knew some of the same people. Dr. King's lawyer, Clarence Jones, was also a friend of Malcolm X. They both were friends with James Baldwin. So even though they had much different upbringings, King, upper middle class in Atlanta, Georgia, Malcolm, really a victim of racial trauma in Nebraska and Lansing, mother institutionalized, his father murdered, Malcolm incarcerated for 76 months. I came to see that they were much more convergent than divergent. And so the idea of the sword and the shield, the metaphor, we usually think of Malcolm as the sword and King as the shield, when they really serve as both. And I thought that when you frame them in the way that I think they should be framed, they become a much more powerful tool for social and political revolutionary change in the United States and globally.
I really appreciate you making that distinction. So I want to share something with you, because this is a talk. So, and again, we're friends. So I'm going to share, I'm going to harken back to my childhood. You may remember in the 90s, Malcolm X Boulevard was a mecca of Black vendors. Much more than it is now, right? Now it's 125th Street, the further you go west. But Malcolm X Boulevard, really, on Saturdays, used to have vendors with oils and shirts and music. You remember this, next to Pam Pam's on 135th. And I remember, much like you, I grew up in a household where my identity was intentionally affirmed by my parents. And both of my parents are history educators. So very similar in that way. So I grew up, even though I was reading E.B. White's Charlotte's Web in fourth or fifth grade, my father brought home a book every single Friday. And I remember reading concurrently the autobiography of Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. And while we were on, and again, I grew up between Texas and New York City. So I went to school in Texas, but I spent my summers and my Christmases in New York City. And he allowed me to choose a shirt. And I had fallen in love with Malcolm X, the philosophy. The influence was so present. And I chose a white t-shirt with a black overlay of Malcolm at a window, kind of pushing the curtain back. And it said at the bottom, and you may remember this. Do you remember this graphic? And it said, "By any means necessary" at the bottom. And he was kind of peering out of a window, right? With I would imagine like an assault rifle, a gun of some sort. And so I decided, and I'm fourth or fifth grade, I decided I was wearing that to school. And I don't know how I got away with it. I had a cardigan on over it. But anyway, I wore it to school, and I am citizenship of the year kid, honor roll, never in trouble. I got sent to the principal's office, and I went off. I remember saying, "This is so unfair. You only want us to learn about Martin Luther King Jr. He was a pacifist. You don't want us to learn about." I was going through my red phase in full display. I believe in Malcolm. And the principal listened to me rant for a good 3 minutes before saying, "Skylar, I don't have a problem with Malcolm X. This doesn't have anything to do with Malcolm X. This is to do with the fact that your shirt has a gun on it, and we have a zero tolerance policy around any type of paraphernalia." And I say that to say that even at that age, 10, 11, I had, in my own very kind of amateur research, seen them as divisive. And of course that was largely because they were, to your point, they were historicized that way, mm-hmm. as two very separate philosophies, two very separate people. And so I like the way that you said that they were each other's alter egos. Yeah. Can you talk to to us about that? Because we've seen this divisive kind of rescripting. We saw it with Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. We've seen it with Malcolm and Martin. Can you talk about that? The sword and the shield, meaning their alter egos.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that Malcolm, I argue in the book, is pushing for a radical Black dignity. And by that, he means really the end of white supremacy and really the rise of Black political self-determination. So more than just pride and beauty and sort of cultural politics, but really taking off the yoke of colonialism and of racial caste connected to slavery. And Black people defining what anti-racism means for themselves and not having white people define that for themselves, for them. And so Malcolm serves as a prosecuting attorney who's basically arguing and charging white America with a series of crimes against Black humanity that date back from racial slavery. So he's really an incredible figure. King is, on the other hand, the defense attorney. He's talking about radical Black citizenship. Very importantly, King defines that as not just the end of racial oppression, but the visible appearance of justice, universal basic income, ending segregation, decent housing, and real citizenship rights that go beyond the vote. So King is interested in, especially by the end, redistribution of wealth. The way in which they serve as each other's alter egos is that over time, they come to see that you need both. You need radical Black dignity and citizenship. And you can see them rubbing off on the other. You know, you can see them after starting off as adversaries and rivals. You could see Malcolm talking about the ballot or the bullet. You know, Malcolm going into the US Senate to support the 1964 Civil Rights Act and meeting King for the first and only time there, right? You can see Malcolm, who had excoriated the March on Washington as the farce on Washington, but he said he found Dr. King's speech very moving. He had challenged King to just wage massive civil disobedience. And by 1965, after Watts, King says he's going to use nonviolence as a political sword, you know, to wage massive nonviolent civil disobedience. So you can really see that they're influencing each other while they're alive. They're both talking about human rights and human dignity. Malcolm tells a reporter in 1964 that him and Dr. King have the same goals, which are human dignity. Malcolm makes the argument that the civil rights movement should be a human rights movement. So all this is swirling. And really, after Malcolm's death, you see King become much more radicalized, become a revolutionary during the last 3 years. And he's really using some of the same language of Malcolm X. He's talking about everything from Black is beautiful to saying that the halls of Congress are running wild with racism, that white people are to blame for urban rebellions because they produce chaos, their racism and white supremacy, yet they're in full-throated denial. King breaks with Lyndon Johnson and says that the US is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. So King really steps up and becomes this radical and revolutionary. And it really, even at the end in 68, he starts to talk about, and he had been talking about this before, but never as bluntly, racial slavery. He says that poor Black people in Marks, Mississippi, the poverty they're experiencing is a crime, against humanity, same language that Malcolm had used. So it's really extraordinary. It's really extraordinary what happens to both of them. But I also think, like what happened to you, we're not given the full picture of who they were. So, and that's how you have the easy dichotomy. You know, you have them as two polarizing figures. You know, one on this side, the other, and so it forces Black people to feel they have to be Team Malcolm or Team Martin when they're really dual sides of this revolutionary coin.
I have a question for you. Based on what you just shared, why do you think that King was sanitized in a way? And this is my opinion, and you are certainly welcome to agree or disagree. But King was sanitized in a way that I think, again, when we're talking about memory and remembering and the remembering, I'm putting that in air quotes, of our civil rights and Black power icons, he was sanitized in a way that I think made him a lot more palatable. because again, the radicalization that you talked about in his last 3 to 4 years of life are really diluted in the recapitulations of his life in history books and even in the media now, right? He is seen as this almost, I want to make sure I'm respectful in my language, almost as this passive, tokenized figure who everybody could digest. Yeah. Whereas posthumously, Malcolm has not received that. He's still very much, I think, even though he was moving, as you said, there was a confluence, if you will, of their two philosophies around the Black experience and Black liberation. But he wasn't. He's still seen, in my opinion, very radical. He's not nearly as palatable to white people by and large, and is certainly not given nearly as much in history books in the way that folks are being formally educated about his journey and his contributions. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that started really in the 1970s and 80s in order to try to get the holiday. So I think that the price of the holiday, because remember, in the last several years of his life, I mean, King's popularity is down. People are calling him a communist, a Marxist. Black people still love and respect King, but King is no longer really, on some levels, he's got this huge global reputation as a Nobel Prize winner. But when you think about the New York Times, Washington Post, they're against him vis-a-vis Vietnam. The president doesn't come to his funeral, although all the other major leaders do. So, King is a troubling icon for people. I mean, 125 million people watch his funeral, but many white people were happy he was assassinated. And there are both urban rebellions in over 100 cities, but there's white people who are clowning and laughing and having parties. Okay, so that's real. That's real. And so it became basically you had a couple of different sides. There was Coretta Scott King, Vincent Harding, the Congressional Black Caucus, different elected officials tried immediately to get a national holiday. But then there were other people who were really, and this is more right-wing racists, who were really determined to say, well, King was a charlatan, and King was, violent, and King was, somebody who's not worthy of our respect or remembrance. And so what Black people were able to do, and again, this is going to come at a cost, because people didn't want the memory of the civil rights movement to fade. And it really does fade, because it fades pretty quickly. Because on the one hand, you've got Jesse Jackson running for president in 84, 88. And when he's in San Francisco in 84, at the Democratic National Convention, he remembers Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, the three civil rights workers who were assassinated just 20 years before. But just 4 years earlier, Ronald Reagan had been in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where they were assassinated, talking about states' rights as some kind of overt dog whistle to the white supremacists in Mississippi, that he was going to allow this kind of unfettered racial terror and racial oppression to continue and be amplified on his watch. So from that perspective, King became something that was really, really vital for at least a very certain segment of the Black community that had gotten some access and become elite. So you think about people like John Lewis. John Lewis was not a congressman yet, but John Lewis is a significant figure who, by the time the King holiday comes, is on the Atlanta City Council. Julian Bond, people King had worked with, is there. Andy Young is part of the Carter administration and mayor of Atlanta. So there was really enough power. There was enough power where really Reagan is forced to sign that bill into a holiday, because in Congress in 1983, and Reagan signs that bill maybe November of 83, there was enough to override a veto. So it was going to happen anyway. Reagan thought King was a communist. Reagan was no friend of King, because obviously Ronald Reagan was a white supremacist and a racist that people don't know. And so
say that again, please, for the people in the back, Dr.
Ronald Reagan very, very, very racist,
Yeah.
and you know. And so when we think about King, what they focus on then is the March on Washington, the positive relationship with the federal government, right? And so the bargain, it becomes a bargain. He gets a holiday, but the way in which he's going to be remembered is as an example of American exceptionalism, as an example that, yes, we had this racial problem, and notice I said racial and not racist problem, but they say racial problem. But we overcame it, and we passed the Civil Rights Act, March on Washington, Nobel Peace Prize, and the Voting Rights Act. And then they just, forgot the last part of his life. So,
as an educator, how do you think we could better advance a collective understanding around the complexities of these two figures? What is our duty as educators? And I'm talking not just those working in post-secondary institutional spaces, but those of us who are educating across communities, as well as our K-12 educators who have a bamboozling curriculum to work with. Quite frankly, in a lot of K-12 schools, the textbooks are just, in terms of history and the way in which Black history is told or remembered, what is our duty first, and what are some strategies that we can more intentionally advance a collective understanding?
Well, I think we have to frame them differently, and that's what the Sword and the Shield does. I think educators have such a hard time because they have to read so much. So the reason I did a dual biography, I wanted folks who've never encountered them to have just one place to go, because you really can't ask teachers if they're going to do a lesson that, here, you got to read these 10 books, because how are they going to have the time to do that? Unless, you're in the academy. If you're a professor, it's something different. But if you're just a day-to-day, that's a bigger grind in a lot of ways. The other is that you can sort of encapsulate Malcolm and Martin by looking at certain events, certain signposts. You can look at both of them in the late 1950s overseas, Malcolm in the Middle East, King in India and in Ghana. So you can talk about the global side of them. You can look at both of them in the early 1960s, before they really, really reached their peaks as these sort of figures that are national, but that are really trying to mobilize different groups that sometimes are receptive to being mobilized, sometimes aren't. So you look at Malcolm in the late 1950s, early 60s, all over the place, in Howard University and in New York City and Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Oakland, Los Angeles. And King is in Georgia and Montgomery, Alabama, and trying to negotiate around the freedom rides, even though it's not his idea. So you can see how both of them in certain ways are beleaguered. You get to see that. Malcolm preaching against police brutality after Ronald Stokes is assassinated in April of 1962 in Los Angeles. And then 63, 64, 65, you really see them converging. They're both different points of their career. They're both negotiating with the LAPD and New York police departments to try to end police brutality unsuccessfully. They both have criticism against Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and Eisenhower. Malcolm's very, very publicly. King against Johnson publicly after Malcolm's death. They both start to talk about radical dignity and citizenship. So you could see those convergences, right? And then in 64, they're both supporting a massive school boycott against racial segregation. Black students, 450,000 of them in 1964, stay out of school because of the terrible conditions in New York, because we usually think about segregation and bad conditions in the South, but these were national issues. So I do think that there's ways to reframe them in ways that K through 12 teachers can do, starting from the sort of simplest introduction all the way to a more complicated analysis.
So my one of my last questions before we wrap that I'd like for you to consider is, what then do you think? Because you've mentioned so many names, so many rich contributors to our collective history and freedom fighters in this movement. And I say movement as across decades, not just the contemporary one. But one of the things that I think is starkly contrasted and different in this current movement and moment than that of movements and moments before is that there is no singular leader, right? And with the passing, I mean, was it Friday was a double whammy in the worst way. We lost C.T. Vivian and John Lewis on the same day, and both representative of a particular era, right? I think one of the things that's really interesting about where we are now is there's no singular, or at least in my opinion, I'd love for you to speak to this. There's no one person or no five people or a triumvirate that I could identify as these are the three folks that are leading the movement. I mean, obviously, as you said, we have Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza as really helping to...
We have Brittany Packnett, we've got Tamika Mallory, we've got a lot of grassroots. I mean, here in Austin, we've got Suki McMahon, we've got so many folks who are leaders. Yeah.
So how do we, but again, there's very few, and I agree with that. And I got to give space to our sister Fatima Mann, who...
Fatima. Yeah.
Here in Austin doing some amazing work. But again, I think our memory of this season, and again, I don't yet know if it's a tragedy or not, is that we can perhaps recall the victims of state-sanctioned violence, police brutality, more readily than we can the leaders who are helping to organize. And I'm not arguing that it should be one way or the other. I just would love for you to speak to why you think that is. Do you think that is strategic? That there are no clear folks who are leading, quote unquote, leading the movement in its contemporary space? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a number of reasons. I think with BLM, it's definitely strategic. And I think that part of it, too, is intersectionality, moving away from a patriarchal, top-down, charismatic leadership model, moving away from a preacher-driven leadership model, which in a lot of ways makes sense, because in some ways this is a restoration, but even more diverse and inclusive from the pre-Cold War era. Because before the Cold War, even as you might have had Black leaders, when we think about historically, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, it's in newspapers and stuff, it's Black male led, but in communities, people know that there are Black women who are leaders and organizers and just, political quilters and coalition builders, right? And these are the community weavers and the healers, right? So there's that. Ella Baker famously said, this is about more than just a hamburger. Organizer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, strong people don't need strong leaders. So one, these sort of patriarchal leaders, and even Angela Davis, were incarcerated, arrested, hounded, assassinated. So there's that, right? And then two, right now, part of it is you do have some leadership, like, look, Reverend William Barber, Moral Mondays. But the very fact that you don't just have one or two or three or four or five, I think makes the movement more dynamic. Because if you have like a cult of personality around the leadership, that means if there's something wrong with that leader, that very much adversely affects the movement. And that's women or men. I think it's good that you don't have anybody who is singularly identified as the leader or spokesperson of the movement. You might have representative people that the movement decides are good people who can speak and at times represent them on cable news, et cetera. But what you do instead is you have a constellation of people. You have Sherilyn Ifill of Legal Defense Fund. You have folks who are doing voting rights campaigns against domestic violence for Black women, anti-homelessness, mass incarceration. And so in a way, the star of the movement are the policy demands, which is really important. So Black Lives Matter has 10-point policy major demands of reparations, defunding the police, prison abolition, freeing all sex workers from prison, free education, free healthcare, publicly financed campaigns, transform the military budget, redistribute wealth, end cash bail. So that's very, very important. So in a lot of ways, I think some people get upset that we can't name, hey, who's the Angela Davis of the movement? But the movement has been really good in terms of moving away from that kind of celebrity and that kind of commodification.
Exactly.
So I think it's powerful and strong in that sense, you know? Yeah.
I fully agree with you, actually. Yeah. I fully agree with you. I just had to bring the question forth.
Yeah, no, I think it's strong. I think it's part of it is like what you want are the demands to be the star.
Yes, exactly. Well, in closing, I'd like to, again, thank you so much for your time. I want to thank you for the wisdom that you've provided us, and also the considerations to advance the conversation, and not only in formal spaces, but also communal spaces, right? So in our K-12, K-16, K-20 spaces, but also in museum education spaces, art education spaces, and the intersectional identities that are ultimately going to be the crux of this liberation work and this cultural and educational awareness. So I thank you for that so much. I would like to ask you one last question, if you'll allow me. Do you believe that there is, do you believe that the outcome will be different this time? And I think you know what I mean in terms of the movement, the demands, everything that's catalyzing the tsunami that we're experiencing in this season of COVID, along with all of the victims of state-sanctioned violence and the lynchings that we've lived through. Do you think that this time will be different? Should we dare to hope, Dr. Joseph?
Yes, I would say definitely dare to hope, but we have to make it difference, because Malcolm X always famously said that there were political wolves in sheep's clothing all around the Black community pretending to be our friends. So when you say strong things like defund the police, abolish prisons, there's going to be a whole network of people and systems, including many of those who are saying Black Lives Matter because they feel under pressure to, who are going to be trying to situate you and push you towards reform, including presidential candidates. But reform can never work on a system that's designed to expressly eradicate and criminalize and punish and assault Black people and kill them. So yes, it can be different this time. There are more white allies. There's more respect and reverence for Black women's leadership. There's more respect and reverence for the complexity of Black identity, including people who are non-able-bodied, who are trans, who are gay, lesbian, queer, non-gender identifying, people who are mentally, emotionally ill, people who are cash poor, HIV positive, incarcerated, the whole gamut, which is unbelievably important, because I think past movements, one of the failures of past movements is that we didn't include everybody. One of the failures of past movements is that even within our movement, we did it during racial slavery and after, we said that there were some Black people whose lives did not matter as much as other Black people. And this here is Black people were saying it, right? We forget the wider society, right? So part of us has been saying, hey, it's not just the sisters of Delta Sigma Theta, but it's the sisters who might be incarcerated and mentally ill who never pledged. They never crossed any line. They're not part of any soror or frat, who we're going to center in this movement, right? So it's not enough for us to be Deltas or part of the Boule or Jack and Jill, and we feel that we're striving and we've won, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we're doing our stroll. We're doing our stroll, our prom stroll. We're saying that we want to actually center these folks who, in other generations, we said were worthless, and it was their fault that they were being dehumanized.
Let me put a disclaimer on that. It was not Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated that ever said. I just want to make sure that the listeners understand. I know you're not saying it. I want to make sure the listeners.
It's not, all the Greeks are great. It's just saying that what we can't do this time is leave anybody behind.
I'm with you.
So from that perspective, and this is what's so great about BLM 2.0, then we're doing well because we're saying that we're all in this together. So you're seeing these marches, not just for Black lives, not just for Black men incarcerated or shot, but for Breonna Taylor, right?
Yes.
So it all, like, Breonna Taylor matters as much as Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. So in that context, our lives matter equally within the Black community. So from that perspective, if it's tied to radical policy transformation, again, we have to be able to say defund the police right here in Austin. We have to be able to say abolish prisons in Austin, and understand that those who oppose that are political enemies of freedom. They are, so we have to understand it. So if somebody's coming to you under the banner of reform, it's not real, because we've had 400 years of false reform and so many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands gone, right? And all these, this caste system connected to the criminal justice system, convict lease system, is rooted in racial slavery. Ava DuVernay, the 13th, shows us that. Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, but Michelle Alexander, New Jim Crow. Malcolm's story shows that. So yes, it can be transformative. I do think we have a generational opportunity to end racism, to end systemic racism, to defeat white supremacy, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. And certainly corporations aren't going to be leading the way. It's going to be grassroots activism, radical activism, that's going to be leading the way. That's led and strategized by really a convergence of Black women, feminists, queer, Black men, bi, trans, the whole deal, because that's us, right? We are James Baldwin, Audre Lorde. We don't have to be in closets and hidden anymore. That's the community. So that's the best part of this. And seeing that New Yorker piece, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Keisha Blaine, women like yourself, alongside of other groups and young people are doing great stuff, young Black people. It's very, very imperative that we know in a very clear and explicit way that our lives matter and that we're pushing for really Black dignity and citizenship for all Black people. And that's going to reverberate nationally and globally. So I do feel hopeful, but we have to be very well aware of the stakes, because the stakes are our lives, the lives of our children, our parents, our grandparents, successive generations, but also the health of this democracy and the fate of the planet. So really, everything hinges on this moment, and not just the next election. Part of the reason why things have not gone well in the past, despite some triumphs, is that people get tired, because this is a thing, as you know, that you have to be involved with for the rest of your life. So one of the things when you meet up with young people and they're so psyched, this is not ending in 2027. We're going to have a party, right? Or 2037 or 2047. That's like our kids and grandkids and great grandkids are still going to have to fight. But I do believe we can make measurable, substantive progress beyond Confederate monuments going down. We're thinking policies like reparations, defund the police, transform the wealth gap between Black and white people, desegregation, and having real Black political and economic power right here in the United States.
So I just have to ask this one last question. It was triggered by your incredible rap there. So and again, you may not have the answer, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how do then those of us that are in the very institutions that we're trying to dismantle or reconstruct serve Black emancipation and liberation? How do we do that? Is it possible? Some would argue that it's not possible.
No, I think it's possible. I mean, we leverage those resources. I mean, before earlier generations sat in at these places and took them over, I wouldn't be at the University of Texas. You wouldn't be there. Dr. Gordon, so all of us had these forebearers who forced the issue. So we can use the power and the leverage we have to make the institution accountable to the community. And I think we're always trying to do that, to leverage the resources that are at our disposal to promote racial justice, to promote racial equality, gender justice, gender equality, desegregation. And Austin has such a brutal history of perpetuating these systems of white supremacy. So we can, and obviously this has to go beyond diversity and inclusion. We have to talk about Black equality and not just diversity, equity, inclusion. We have to talk about not just anti-racism, but centering racial justice at the core of whether it's College of Pharmacy or the LBJ School or UT athletics. That's what we're talking about. So it's got to be from stem to root. We've got a whole challenge ahead of us to transform racist institutions that are predicated on Black dehumanization and demonization, and the death of us into institutions that are based on justice and equality. So it's a long order, but we can do it. I'm convinced.
I fully agree with you, and fight against the fatigue. I think that's the message. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to be radically inclusive, so that there are no more Bayard Russins that are pushed further into the margin.
No, those days are over. Yes,
that's no more. And I think being not only radically inclusive, but also hyper conscious of intersectional identities and the ways in which so many of us experience oppression. And I appreciate the elevation of Black women and trans folk and differently abled folk or disabled folk, those who choose whichever identity, because again, they have been decentered for so long. And even in conversations around Black justice and Black liberation, they are not necessarily included. So thank you for that. This should have been 2 hours. We'll definitely have you back if you'll allow us, if you will grant us that time. This was incredibly enriching, and I have no doubt that our listeners will take away so much. Again, I've already said it. I will say it again. The Sword and the Shield, one of many. If you don't have it, go out and get it now, by Dr. Peniel Joseph. As I said, I'm giving it out for everybody's birthday, every holiday there is. It's a necessary read. And again, I love that you're able to do a comprehensive history of these two giants in a single tome. So thank you so much for that intentionality as well. And again, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for following the Calaboose African American History Museum. And again, we're wrapping up our talk today, Monday, July 20th, with Dr. Peniel Joseph, titled A Familiar Moment, Re-Examining Historical Movements and Leaders of the Past, Now into the Present. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.